Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to our study of In Search of the Miraculous. We've arrived at chapter 9, and chapter 9 is another heavily diagrammatic chapter. There's a lot of diagrams, a lot of numbers, a lot of combinations of ideas. And so if you're new to In Search of the Miraculous, I definitely recommend go to start at the beginning. I wouldn't have this as your first introduction to In Search of the Miraculous, because you may get lost or disheartened. And this chapter is very interesting because it combines several ideas that we've come in contact with throughout the book. And now in this chapter, what Gurdjieff does is he sort of combines two or three of them together in a sense to upgrade the idea, I suppose. So what I'm going to do now is just go through. I'm not going to read out all the contents, but why I put the contents on the screen, you can also find the contents in the description, and I'll just put those up for a moment so that you can just have a little browse and perhaps pause the video if you'd like, because it's there's a lot going on in this chapter, and this is the second half of those the contents, I suppose, of the chapter. So if you'd like, you can pause that or go back. And much of the chapter speaks about hydrogens and also food for the system. Gurdjieff talks about the air that we breathe is the first kind of food, the physical food that we eat is the second kind, and then the impressions we receive would be the third kind. And these are some of the things that he brings in, and I'm just going to share where you can find them in their first instances in the book if you want to go back and sort of refresh yourself. So he talks about the ray of creation in this chapter, and we first come into contact with the chapter the ray of creation, or them speaking about the ray of creation, in chapter 5. He combines the ray of creation with octaves, which we can find in chapter 7. Then, like I say, he talks about hydrogen. Then he goes on to talk about different atoms of different density and weight. Then he talks about bodies, which you can also find in chapter 2, the 4 different bodies, the physical, emotional, intellectual, and I can't think of the other body. Maybe I'll go and find that out quickly, but forgive me. And then he goes on to talk about the food diagram and puts all this together. How the food, the bodies, the impressions that we receive, all of this goes to, that's how we can raise our awareness through. He talks about the second shock and sort of becoming more aware through the reception of the second shock, and we can discuss the second shock in more detail later on maybe. And hello there, Kathy. I hope you've been having a nice day. I was thinking about you earlier and how you've been getting on, but maybe emotional, intellectual and physical. Yeah, so maybe there is only 3 and I made the 4th one up, or maybe the higher body. But anyway, let's not get distracted by the bodies. And nice to see you, Kathy. And so, like I say, there's a lot of diagrams and a lot of numbers in this chapter. So it's one that we need to discuss and go through again and again, because you're not just going to get this chapter, in one go. Well, and if you do, help me to understand, please. So this is chapter 9 of In Search of the Miraculous, and let us begin. At one lecture, G began to draw the diagram of the universe in an entirely new way. So far we have spoken of the forces that create worlds, he said, of the process of creation proceeding from the absolute. We will now speak of the processes which take place in the already created and existing world. But you must remember that the process of creation never stops, although on a planetary scale growth proceeds so slowly that if we reckon it in our time, planetary conditions can be regarded as permanent for us. Therefore, let us take the ray of creation after the universe has already been created. The action of the Absolute upon the world or upon the worlds created by it or within it continues. The action of each of these worlds upon subsequent worlds continues in exactly the same way. All suns, or the Milky Way, influence our sun. The sun influences the planets. All planets influence our Earth, and the Earth influences the moon. These influences are transmitted by means of radiations passing through starry and interplanetary space. In order to study these radiations, let us take the ray of creation in an abridged form: absolute, sun, earth, moon. Or in other words, let us imagine the ray of creation in the form of 3 octaves of radiation. Sorry, no. Sorry, yes, here we go, and now at the bottom. In the form of 3 octaves of radiations. The first octave between the Absolute and the Sun, the second octave between the Sun and the Earth, and the third octave between the Earth and the Moon. And let us examine the passage of radiations between these 4 fundamental points in the universe. We have to find our place and understand our functions in this universe, which is taken in the form of 3 octaves of radiations between 4 points. Oh, hello there, 161157. Glad to see you. In the first octave, the Absolute will include 2 notes, Do and Si, with the interval between them. Figure 20. Then will follow notes La, Sol, Fa, that is, Figure 21. Then an interval and the shock filling it, unknown to us, but nevertheless inevitably existing. Then Mi, Re, as you can see, Figure 22. The radiations reach the Sun. 2 notes are included in the Sun itself, Do, an interval, and Si, and then follow La, Sol, Fa, radiations going towards the Earth, as you can see in Figure 23. Then an interval and the shock of organic life which fills it, then Mi and Re. The Earth, Do, an interval, Si, and then Fa, La, Sol, Fa, radiations going towards the Moon. Then again an interval, a shock, unknown to us, then Mi, Re, and the Moon, Do. These 3 octaves of radiations, in which form we shall now imagine the universe, will enable us to explain the relation of matters and forces of different planes of the world to our own life. It must be observed that although there are 6 intervals in these 3 octaves, only 3 of them actually require to be supplemented from outside. The first interval between Do and Si is filled by the will of the Absolute. The second interval, Do, Si, is filled by the influence of the Sun's mass upon radiations passing through it. And the third interval, Do, Si, is filled by the action of the Earth's mass upon radiations passing through it. Only the intervals between Fa and Mi have to be filled by additional shocks. These additional shocks can come either from other octaves which pass across the given point, or from parallel octaves which start from higher points. We know nothing about the nature of the shock between Mi, Fa in the first octave Absolute Sun, but the shock in the octave Sun Earth is organic life on Earth, that is, the 3 notes La, Sol, Fa of the octave which starts in the Sun. The nature of the shock between Mi and Fa in the octave Earth Moon is unknown to us. It must be noted that the term a point in the universe which I have used has a quite definite meaning, namely a point represents a certain combination of hydrogens which is organized in a definite place and fulfills a definite function in one or another system. The concept point cannot be replaced by the concept hydrogen because hydrogen means simply matter, not limited in space. A point is always limited in space. At the same time, a point of the universe can be designated by the number of the hydrogen which predominates in it or is central in it. If we now examine the first of these 3 octaves of radiations, that is, the octave Absolute Sun, from the point of view of the law of 3, we shall see that the note Do will be the conductor of the active force, designated by the number 1, while the matter in which this force acts will be carbon, C. The active force which creates the note do in the absolute represents the maximum frequency of vibrations or the greatest density of vibrations. The expression density of vibration corresponds to frequency of vibrations and is used as the opposite to density of matter, that is to say, the higher the density of matter, the lower the density of vibrations, and vice versa. The higher the density of vibrations, the lower the density of the matter. The greatest density of vibrations is to be found in the finest, the most rarefied matter, and in the densest matter possible, vibrations slow down and come almost to a stop. Therefore, the finest matter corresponds to the greatest density of vibrations. The active force in the absolute represents the maximum density of vibrations, while the matter in which these vibrations proceed, that is, the first carbon, represents the minimum density of matter. The note C in the absolute will be the conductor of the passive force designated by the number 2, and the matter in which this passive force acts, or in which sounds, the note C will be oxygen, O. The note La will be the conductor of the neutralizing force designated by the number 3, and the matter in which sounds the note La will be nitrogen, N. In the order of the action of the forces, they will stand in the succession 1, 2, 3, that is, corresponding to the matters carbon, oxygen, nitrogen. But by density of matter, they will stand in the order carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, that is 1, 3, 2, because nitrogen, by retaining the number 3, that is to say, by being the conductor of the neutralizing force, stands by its density of matter between carbon and oxygen appears as the densest of the 3. And now you may see what I was saying, that this may require a pen and a pencil and some thought. Carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen together will give matter of the 4th order, or hydrogen, whose density we will designate by the number 6 as the sum of 1, 2, and 3, that is H6. So here we have the first triad. CON retain their numbers 1, 2, 3. Carbon is always 1, oxygen is always 2, and nitrogen is always 3. But being more active than oxygen, nitrogen enters as the active principle in the next triad, and enters with the density of 2. In other words, nitrogen has a density of 2 and oxygen a density of 3. So that the note La of the first triad is the conductor of the active force of the next triad, which it enters with the density of 2. If carbon enters with the density of 2, then oxygen and nitrogen must correspond to it in densities, repeating the ratio of densities of the first triad. In the first triad, the ratio of densities was 1, 2, 3. In the second triad, it should be 2, 4, 6. That is, carbon of the second triad will possess the density of 2, nitrogen a density of 4, oxygen a density of 6. Taken together, they will give hydrogen 12. The second triad. According to the same plan and order, the following triad will be constructed Fa, Shock, Mi. Carbon, which was nitrogen in the second triad, enters with a density of 4. The nitrogen and oxygen corresponding to it must have a density of 8 and 12. Together they will give hydrogen 24. The third triad. The next triad, Mi, Re, Do, by the same plan and order will give hydrogen 48. The fourth triad, the triad Do, Si, La, will give the hydrogen 96. And there you can see the fifth triad. And the triad La, Sol, Fa, hydrogen 192. The sixth triad. Fa, Shock, Mi, hydrogen 348. The seventh triad. Mi, Re, Do, hydrogen 768 in the eighth triad. Do, Si, La, hydrogen 1536 in the ninth triad. And La, Sol, Fa, hydrogen 3072 in the 10th triad. Fa, Shock, Mi, hydrogen 6144, as you can see, the 11th triad. Mi, Re, Do, hydrogen 12,288, the 12th triad. 12 hydrogens are obtained with densities ranging from 6 to 12,288. See Table 1, coming next. These 12 hydrogens represent 12 categories of matter contained in the universe from the absolute to the moon, and if it were possible to establish exactly which of these matters constitute man's organism and act in it, this alone would determine what place man occupies in the world. And here is the full diagram of the table of hydrogens, and you can see here in the top left we have hydrogen 6, and in the bottom right hydrogen 12,288, and we'll learn in a moment or in a subsequent chapter that these hydrogens each refer to different materials in the universe. But at the place where we are situated, within the limits of our ordinary powers and capacities, hydrogen 6 is irresolvable. We can take it, therefore, as hydrogen 1. The next hydrogen 12, as hydrogen 6. Reducing all the hydrogens that follow by 2, we obtain a scale from hydrogen 1 to hydrogen 6,144. See Table 2 below. But hydrogen 6 is nevertheless still irresolvable for us. Therefore, we can also take it as hydrogen 1, take the next hydrogen after it as hydrogen 6, and reduce all the following again by 2. So this is, you can see here, we've gone from hydrogens in the first table on the left, hydrogen 6 to 12,288. And again, these are things are irresolvable. So then we go from H1 to H6144. And then in the final one on the furthest right, H1 to 3072. Here. The scale obtained in this way from 1 to 3072 can serve us for the study of man. See Table 3, which is above here on the right, you can see. All matters from hydrogen 6 to hydrogen 3072 are to be found and play a part in the human organism. Each of these hydrogens includes a very large group of chemical substances known to us, linked together by some function in connection with our organism. In other words, it must not be forgotten that the term hydrogen has a very wide meaning. Any simple element is a hydrogen of a certain density, but any combination of elements which possesses a definite function, either in the world or in the human organism, is also a hydrogen. This kind of definition of matters enables us to classify them in the order of their relation to life and to the functions of our organism. Let us again begin with hydrogen 768. This hydrogen is defined as food. In other words, hydrogen 768 includes all substances which can serve as food for man. Substances which cannot serve as food, such as a piece of wood, refer to hydrogen 1536, a piece of iron to hydrogen 3072. On the other hand, a thin matter with poor nutritive properties will be nearer to hydrogen 384. Hydrogen 384 will be defined as water. Hydrogen 192 is the air of our atmosphere which we breathe. Hydrogen 96 is represented by rarefied gases which man cannot breathe, but which play a very important part in his life. And further, this is the matter of animal magnetism, of emanations from the human body, of N-rays, hormones, vitamins, and so on. In other words, with hydrogen 96 ends what is called matter, or what is regarded as matter by our physics and chemistry. Hydrogen 96 also includes matters that are almost imperceptible to our chemistry, or perceptible only by their traces or results, often merely presumed by some and denied by others. And this is interesting now because we're going to go even higher than hydrogen 96, and this is where science stops. Science stops here because science only believes, if you like, or only takes as existing what can be counted, weighed and measured. And now we're going to get into these finer hydrogens and their apparatus, their machines for registering matter and frequency and vibrations. They shut down, they finish here, they can't go any further. And like he says there, often merely presumed by some and denied by others. So but with In Search of the Miraculous and what Gurdjieff is sharing here in this chapter, we have a new framework for the universe. And if you're scientifically minded and, you need to be able to weigh and measure it and count it, then this may be trouble for you because you might be saying, oh, this is woo-woo, how do we know? But if you take all of these things together, read the whole book, go back, study again, learn, think about, you'll see that maybe this is, I've listened to a few podcasts recently with people talking about these theories of everything. And when I'm hearing this mathematician, physicist, all I can think about is, what Mr. Gurdjieff's saying here. But a brief digression, let's get back to the text. Hydrogens 48, 24, 12 and 6 are matters unknown to physics and chemistry, matters of our psychic and spiritual life on different levels. Altogether, in examining the table of hydrogens, it must always be remembered that each hydrogen of this table includes an enormous number of different substances connected together by one and the same function in our organism and representing a definite cosmic group. Hydrogen 12 corresponds to the hydrogen of chemistry, atomic weight 1. Carbon, nitrogen and oxygen of chemistry have the atomic weights 12, 14 and 16. In addition, it is possible to point out in the table of atomic weights elements which correspond to certain hydrogens, that is, elements whose atomic weights stand almost in the correct octave ratio to one another. Thus, hydrogen 24 corresponds to fluorine, atomic weight 19. Hydrogen 48 corresponds to, fluorine was that, atomic weight 19. Hydrogen 48 corresponds to chlorine, atomic weight 35.5. Hydrogen 96 corresponds to bromine, atomic weight 80, and hydrogen 192 corresponds to iodine, atomic weight 127. The atomic weights of these elements stand almost in the ratio of an octave to one another. In other words, the atomic weight of one of them is almost twice as much as the atomic weight of another. The slight inexactitude, that is, the incomplete octave relationship, is brought about by the fact that ordinary chemistry does not take into consideration all the properties of a substance, namely, it does not take into consideration cosmic properties. The chemistry of which we speak here studies matter on a different basis from ordinary chemistry and takes into consideration not only the chemical and physical, but also the psychic and cosmic properties of matter. This chemistry or alchemy regards matter, first of all, from the point of view of its functions which determine its place in the universe and its relations to other matters, and then from the point of view of its relation to man and to man's functions. By an atom of a substance is meant a certain small quantity of the given substance that retains all its chemical, cosmic and psychic properties because, in addition to its cosmic properties, every substance also possesses psychic properties, that is, a certain degree of intelligence. The concept atom may therefore refer not only to elements, but also to all compound matters possessing definite functions in the universe or in the life of man. There can be an atom of water, an atom of air, that is, atmospheric air, suitable for man's breathing, an atom of bread, an atom of meat, and so on. An atom of water will, in this case, be 1/10 of a cubic millimeter of water taken at a certain temperature by a special thermometer. This will be a tiny drop of water which under certain conditions can be seen with the naked eye. This atom is the smallest quantity of water that retains all the properties of water. On further division, some of these properties disappear, that is to say, it will not be water, but something approaching the gaseous state of water, steam, which does not differ chemically in any way from water in a liquid state, but possesses different functions and therefore different cosmic and psychic properties. The table of hydrogens makes it possible to examine all substances making up man's organism from the point of view of their relation to different planes of the universe. And as every function of man is a result of the action of definite substances, and as each substance is connected with a definite plane in the universe, this fact enables us to establish the relation between man's functions and the planes of the universe. So, there you have that first section about the hydrogens, and like I say, you have to take it and try and include everything together in order to get a fuller picture. I ought to say at this point that the 3 octaves of radiations and the table of hydrogens derived from them were a stumbling block to us for a long time. So this is now Ouspensky speaking. The fundamental and the most essential principle of the transition of the triads and the structure of matter I understood only later, and I will speak of it in its proper place. In my exposition of G's lectures in general, I am trying to observe a chronological order, although this is not always possible, as some things were repeated very many times and entered in one form or another into almost all lectures. Upon me personally, the table of hydrogens produced a very strong impression which, later on, was to become still stronger. I felt in this ladder reaching from earth to heaven something very like the sensation of the world which came to me several years before during my strange experiments when I felt so strongly the connectedness, the wholeness, and the mathematicalness of everything in the world. Again, back to my physicist friend who thinks he's got the fear of everything. This lecture, with different variations, was repeated many times, that is, either in connection with the explanation of the ray of creation, or in connection with the explanation of the law of octaves. But in spite of the strange sensation it gave to me, I was far from giving it its proper value the first times I heard it, and, above all, I did not understand at once that these ideas are much more difficult to assimilate, and are much deeper in their content than they appeared from their simple exposition. I have preserved in my memory one episode. It happened at one of the repetitions of this lecture on the structure of matter in connection with the mechanics of the universe. The lecture was read by P, a young engineer belonging to G's Moscow pupils, whom I have mentioned. I arrived when the lecture had already begun. Hearing familiar words, I decided that I had already heard this lecture, and therefore, sitting down in a corner of the large drawing room, I smoked and thought of something else. G was there too. "Why did you not listen to the lecture?" he asked me after it was over. "But I have already heard it," I said. G shook his head reproachfully, and quite honestly I did not understand what he expected from me, why I ought to listen for a second time to the same lecture. I understood only much later, when lectures were over and when I tried to sum up mentally all I had heard. Often, in thinking a question over, I remembered quite distinctly that it had been spoken of at one of the lectures, but what precisely had been said I could, unfortunately, by no means always remember, and I would have given a great deal to hear it once more. Nearly 2 years later, in November 1917, a small party of us, consisting of 6 people, among whom was G, was living on the Black Sea, shore 25 miles north of Topaz, in a small country house more than a mile from the nearest habitation. One evening we sat and talked. It was already late and the weather was very bad. A northeast wind was blowing which brought now rain, now snow in squalls. I was thinking just of certain deductions from the table of hydrogens, chiefly about one inconsistency in this diagram as compared with another of which we heard later. My question referred to hydrogens below the normal level. Later on I will explain exactly what it was I asked and what, long afterwards, G answered. This time he did not give me a direct answer. "You ought to know that," he said. "It was spoken of in the lectures in St. Petersburg. You could not have listened. Do you remember a lecture that you did not want to hear, saying you already knew it? But what was said then is precisely what you ask about now." After a short silence he said, "Well, if you now heard that somebody was given the same lecture at Topaz, would you go there on foot?" "I would," I said. And indeed, though I felt very strongly how long, difficult, and cold the road could be, at the same time I knew that this would not stop me. G laughed. "Will you really go?" he asked. "Think, 25 miles, darkness, snow, rain, wind." What is there to think about? I said. You know I have walked the whole way more than once when there was no horses or there was no room for me in the cart, and for no reward, simply because there was nothing else to be done. Of course I would go without a word if somebody were going to give a lecture on these things at to pass. Yes, said G, if only people really reasoned in this way, but in reality they reason in exactly the opposite way. Without any particular necessity they would face any difficulties you like, but on a matter of importance that can really bring them something that will not move a finger. Such is human nature. Man never on any account wants to pay for anything, and above all he does not want to pay for what is most important for him. You know that everything must be paid for, and that it must be paid for in proportion to what is received. But usually a man thinks to the contrary. For trifles, for things that are perfectly useless to him, he will pay anything, but for something important, never. This must come to him of itself. And as to the lecture, what you ask was actually spoken of in St. Petersburg. If you had listened then, you would now understand that there is no contradiction whatever between the diagrams and that there cannot be any. But to return to St. Petersburg. In looking back now, I cannot help being astonished at the speed with which G transmitted to us the principal ideas of this system. Of course, a great deal depended on his manner of exposition, upon his astonishing capacity for bringing into prominence all principal and essential points, and for not going into unnecessary details until the principal points had been understood. After the hydrogens, G at once went further. We want to do, but, he began the next lecture, in everything we do we are tied and limited by the amount of energy produced by our organism. Every function, every state, every action, every thought, every emotion requires a certain definite energy, a certain definite substance. We come to the conclusion that we must remember ourselves, but we can remember ourselves only if we have in us the energy for self-remembering. We can study something, understand or feel something only if we have the energy for understanding, feeling or studying. What, then, is a man to do when he begins to realize that he has not enough energy to attain the aims he has set before himself? The answer to this is that every normal man has quite enough energy to begin work on himself. It is only necessary to learn how to save the greater part of the energy we possess for useful work, instead of wasting it unproductively. Energy is spent chiefly on unnecessary and unpleasant emotions, on the expectation of unpleasant things, possible and impossible, on bad moods, on unnecessary haste, nervousness, irritability, imagination, daydreaming, and so on. Energy is wasted on the wrong work of centers, or unnecessary tension of the muscles, out of all proportion to the work produced. On perpetual chatter which absorbs an enormous amount of energy, on the interest continually taken in things happening around us or to other people, and having in fact no interest whatever, on the constant waste of the force of attention, and so on and so on. In the beginning, to struggle with these habitual sides of his life, a man saves an enormous amount of energy, and with the help of this energy he can easily begin the work of self-study and self-perfection. Further on, however, the problem becomes more difficult. Having, to a certain extent, balanced his machine and ascertained for himself that it produces much more energy than he expected, a man nevertheless comes to the conclusion that this energy is not enough, and that, if he wishes to continue his work, he must increase the amount of energy produced. The study of the working of the human organism shows this to be quite possible. The human organism represents a chemical factory planned for the possibility of a very large output, but in the ordinary conditions of life the output of this factory never reaches the full production possible to it, because only a small part of the machinery is used, which produces only that quantity of material necessary to maintain its own existence. Factory work of this kind is obviously uneconomic in the highest degree. The factory actually produces nothing. All its machinery, all its elaborate equipment actually serve no purpose at all, in that it maintains only with difficulty its own existence. The work of the factory consists in transforming one kind of matter into another, namely, the coarser matters in the cosmic sense into finer ones. The factory receives as raw material from the outer world a number of coarse hydrogens and transforms them into finer hydrogens by means of a whole series of complicated alchemical processes. But in the ordinary conditions of life, the production by the human factory of the finer hydrogens, in which, from the point of view of the possibility of higher states of consciousness and the work of higher centers, we are particularly interested, is insufficient, and they are all wasted on the existence of the factory itself. If we could succeed in bringing the production up to its possible maximum, we should then begin to save the fine hydrogens. Then the whole of the body, all the tissues, all the cells would become saturated with these fine hydrogens, which would gradually settle in them, crystallizing in a special way. The crystallization of the fine hydrogens would gradually bring the whole organism into a higher level, onto a higher plane of being. This, however, cannot happen in the ordinary conditions of life because the factory expends all that it produces. Learn to separate the fine from the coarse. This principle from the emerald tablets of Hermes Trismegistus refers to the work of the human factory, and if a man learns to separate the fine from the coarse, that is, if he brings the production of the fine hydrogens to its possible maximum, he will, by this very fact, create for himself the possibility of an inner growth, which can be brought about by no other means. Inner growth, the growth of the inner bodies of man, the astral, the mental, and so on, is a material process completely analogous to the growth of the physical body. In order to grow, a child must have good food. His organism must be in a healthy condition to prepare from this food the material necessary for the growth of the tissues. The tissues. The same thing is necessary for the growth of the astral body, out of the various kinds of food entering it. The organism must produce the substances necessary for the growth of the astral body. Moreover, the astral body requires for its growth the same substances as those necessary to maintain the physical body, only in much greater quantities. If the physical organism begins to produce a sufficient quantity of these fine substances and the astral body within it becomes formed, this astral organism will require for its maintenance less of these substances than it required during its growth. The surplus from these substances can then be used for the formation and growth of the mental body, which will grow with the help of the same substances that feed the astral body, but of course the growth of the mental body will require more of these substances than the growth and feeding of the astral body. The surplus of the substances left over from the feeding of the mental body will go to the growth of the fourth body, but in all cases the surplus will have to be very large. All the fine substances necessary for the growth and feeding of the higher bodies must be produced within the physical organism, and the physical organism is able to produce them provided the human factory is working properly and economically. All the substances necessary for the maintenance of the life of the organism, for psychic work, for the higher functions of consciousness and the growth of the higher bodies are produced by the organism from the food which enters it from outside. The human organism receives three kinds of food. 1. The ordinary food we eat. 2. The air we breathe. And 3. Our impressions. It is not difficult to agree that air is a kind of food for the organism, but in what way impressions can be food may appear at first difficult to understand. We must, however, remember that with every external impression, whether it takes the form of sound or vision or smell, we receive from outside a certain amount of energy, a certain number of vibrations. This energy which enters the organism from outside is food. Moreover, as has been said before, energy cannot be transmitted without matter. If an external impression brings external energy with it into the organism, it means that external matter also enters, which feeds the organism in the full meaning of the term. For its normal existence, the organism must receive all three kinds of food, that is, physical food, air, and impressions. The organism cannot exist on one or even on two kinds of food. All three are required. But the relation of these foods to one another and their significance for the organism is not the same. The organism can exist for a comparatively long time without a supply of fresh physical food. Cases of starvation are known lasting for over 60 days, when the organism lost none of its vitality and recovered very quickly as soon as it began to take food. Of course, starvation of this kind cannot be considered as complete, since in all cases of such artificial starvation, people have taken water. Nevertheless, even without water, a man can live without food for several days. Without air, he can exist only for a few minutes, not more than 2 or 3. As a rule, a man dies after being 4 minutes without air. Without impressions, a man cannot live a single moment. If the flow of impressions were to be stopped in some way, or if the organism were deprived of its capacity for receiving impressions, it would immediately die. The flow of impressions coming to us from outside is like a driving belt communicating motion to us. The principal motor for us is nature, the surrounding world. Nature transmits to us through our impressions the energy by which we live and move and have our being. If the inflow of this energy is arrested, our machine will immediately stop working. Thus, of the 3 kinds of food, the most important for us is impressions, although it stands to reason that a man cannot exist for long on impressions alone. Impressions and air enable man to exist a little longer. Impressions, air, and physical food enable the organism to live to the end of its normal term of life and to produce the substances necessary not only for the maintenance of life, but also for the creation and growth of higher bodies. The process of transforming the substances which enter the organism into finer ones is governed by the law of octaves. Let us take the human organism in the form of a 3-story factory. The upper floor of this factory consists of a man's head, the middle floor of the chest, and the lower of the stomach, back, and the lower part of the body. Figure 25, as you can see. The physical food is hydrogen 768, or La Sol Fa, of the 3rd cosmic octave of radiations. This hydrogen enters the story of the organism as oxygen Do 768. And again, we come to another diagrammatically heavy part of the book where will require going over and over, relating to other sections, and just chewing it down. The food diagram, you have to chew it. And figure 26, the entrance of food, hydrogen 768, into the organism. Oxygen 768 meets with carbon 192, which is present in the organism. From the union of oxygen 768 and carbon 192 is obtained nitrogen 384. Nitrogen 384 is the next note, Re, the beginning of the digestion of food in the diagram. Note, carbons which are present in the organism are marked circle, a sun-like circle. Re 384, which becomes oxygen in the next triad, meets with carbon 96 in the organism and together with it produces a new nitrogen 192, which is the note Me 192. Continuation of the digestion of food, hydrogen 768 in the organism. As it is known from the law of octaves, Mi cannot pass independently into Fa in an ascending octave. An additional shock is necessary. If an additional shock is not received, the substance Mi 192 cannot by itself pass into the full note Fa. At the given place in the organism where Mi 192 ought apparently to come to a stop, there enters the second food, air, in the form of Do 192, that is, Mi, Re, Do, of the 2nd cosmic octave of radiations. The note Do possesses all the necessary semitones, that is, all the energy necessary for the transition to the next note, and it gives, as it were, a part of its energy to the note Mi, which has the same density as itself. The energy of Do gives Me 192 force enough, while uniting with carbon 48 already in the organism to pass into nitrogen 96. Nitrogen 96 will be the note Fa. So as you can see here, the entrance of air, hydrogen 192, into the organism and the shock which air gives in the interval Mi Fa of the food octave. Fa 96, by uniting with carbon 24, present in the organism, passes into nitrogen 48, the note sol. Continuation of the food octave, transition of products of Continuation of the food octave, transition of products of nutrition into sol 48. The note sol 48, by uniting with carbon 12 present in the organism, passes into nitrogen 24, La 24. Continuation of the food octave, transition of products of nutrition into La 24. La 24 unites with carbon 6 present in the organism and is transformed into nitrogen 12 or C12. C12 is the highest substance produced in the organism from physical food with the help of the additional shock obtained from the air. Do 192, air entering in the middle story of the factory in the character of oxygen and giving part of its energy to Me 192, unites in its turn at a certain place with carbon 48 present in the organism and passes into Ray 96, the beginning of the digestion of air into the organism. Ray 96 passes into Me 48 with the help of carbon 24, and with this the development of the second octave comes to a stop. For the transition of Me into Fa, an additional shock is necessary, but at this point nature has not prepared any additional shock, and the second octave, that is, the air octave, cannot develop further, and in the ordinary conditions of life it does not develop further. The third octave begins with Do 48. Impressions enter the organism in the form of oxygen 48, that is, La Sol Fa, of the second cosmic octave, Sun Earth. Do 48 has sufficient energy to pass into the following note, but at that place in the organism where Do 48 enters, the carbon 12 necessary for this is not present. At the same time, Do 48 does not come into contact with Me 48, so that it can neither itself pass into the next note nor give part of its energy to Me 48. And this is the entry of impressions into the organism. Under normal conditions, that is, the conditions of normal existence, the production of the fine matters by the factory at this point comes to a stop, and the third octave sounds as Do only. The highest substance produced by the factory is C12, and for all its higher functions the factory is able to use only this higher matter. So here you see at the top Do 48, that's the entry of impressions. Below that, Do 192 is the entry of air, and Do 768 in the bottom is the entry of physical food. The three kinds of food and the digestions of hydrogen 768 and hydrogen 192 in the organism with the help of one mechanical shock. The normal state of the organism and the normal production of finer substances from the products of nutrition. There is, however, a possibility of increasing the output, that is, of enabling the air octave and the impression octave to develop further. For this purpose it is necessary to create a special kind of artificial shock at the point where the beginning of the third octave is arrested. This means that the artificial shock must be applied to the note Do 48. But what is meant by an artificial shock? It is connected with the moment of the reception of an impression. The note Do 48 designates the moment when an impression enters our consciousness. An artificial shock at this point means a certain kind of effort made at the moment of receiving an impression. It has been explained before that in ordinary conditions of life we do not remember ourselves. We do not remember, that is, we do not feel ourselves, are not aware of ourselves at the moment of a perception, of an emotion, of a thought, or of an action. If a man understands this and tries to remember himself, every impressions he receives while remembering himself will, so to speak, be doubled. In an ordinary psychic state, I simply look at a street. But if I remember myself, I do not simply look at the street. I feel that I am looking, as though saying to myself, I am looking. Instead of one impression of the street, there are two impressions, one of the street and another of myself looking at it. This second impression, produced by the fact of my remembering myself, is the additional shock. Moreover, it very often happens that the additional sensation connected with self-remembering brings with it an element of emotion. That is, the work of the machine attracts a certain amount of carbon-12 to the place in question. Efforts to remember oneself, observation of oneself at the moment of receiving an impression, observation of one's impressions at the moment of receiving them, registering, so to speak, the reception of impressions and the simultaneous defining of the impressions received, all this taken together doubles the intensity of the impressions and carries dou 48 to Re 24. At the same time, the effort connected with the transition of one note to another and the passage of 48 itself to 24 enables dou 48 of the third octave to come into contact with mi 48 of the second octave and to give this note the requisite amount of energy necessary for the transition of mi into fa. In this way, the shock given to dou 48 extends also to mi 48 and enables the second octave to develop. Mi 48 passes to Fa 24, Fa 24 passes to Sol 12, Sol 12 passes to La 6. La 6 is the highest matter produced by the organism from air, that is, from the second kind of food. This, however, is obtained only by making a conscious effort at the moment an impression is received. It is necessary to understand what this means. We all breathe the same air. Apart from the elements known to our science, the air contains a great number of substances unknown to science. Indefinable, for it is inaccessible to its observation. But exact analysis is possible both of the air inhaled and of the air exhaled. This exact analysis shows that although the air inhaled by different people is exactly the same air, the air exhaled is quite different. Let us suppose that the air we breathe is composed of 20 different elements unknown to our science. A certain number of these elements are absorbed by every man when he breathes. Let us suppose that 5 of these elements are always absorbed. Consequently, the air exhaled by every man is composed of 15 elements. 5 of them have gone to feeding the organism. But some people exhale not 15, but only 10 elements. That is to say, they absorb 5 elements more. These 5 elements are higher hydrogens. These higher hydrogens are present in every small particle of air we inhale. By inhaling air, we introduce these higher hydrogens into ourselves, but if our organism does not know how to extract them out of the particles of air and retain them, they are exhaled back into the air. If the organism is able to extract and retain them, they remain in it. In this way, we all breathe the same air, but we extract different substances from it. Some extract more, others less. In order to extract more, it is necessary to have in our organism a certain quantity of corresponding fine substances. Then the fine substances contained in the organism act like a magnet on the fine substances contained in the air, in the inhaled air. We come again to the old alchemical law. In order to make gold, it is first of all necessary to have a certain quantity of real gold. If no gold whatever is possessed, there is no means whatever of making it. The whole of alchemy is nothing but an allegorical description of the human factory and its work of transforming base metals, coarse substances, into precious ones, fine substances. We have followed the development of 2 octaves. The third octave, that is, the octave of impressions, began through a conscious effort. Dou 48 passes to Re 24. Re 24 passes to Mi 12. At this point, the development of the octave comes to a stop. See figure 38 that we have here. Development of the octave of impressions after the first conscious shock. Now, if we examine the result of the development of these three octaves, we shall see that the first octave has reached C12, the second La 6, and the third Mi 12. Thus, the first and third octaves stop at notes which are unable to pass to the following notes. Figure 39. The complete picture of the intensive work of the organism and of the intensive production of substances from the products of nutrition after the first conscious shock, that being self-remembering. So, there you go. Easy. For the two octaves to develop further, a second conscious shock is needed at a certain point in the machine. A new conscious effort is necessary which will enable the two octaves to continue their development. The nature of this effort demands special study. From the point of view of the general work of the machine, it can be said in general that this effort is connected with the emotional life, that it is a special kind of influence over one's emotions. But what this kind of influence really is and how it has to be produced can be explained only in connection with the general description of the work of the human factory or the human machine. The practice of not expressing unpleasant emotions, of not identifying, of not considering inwardly is the preparation for the second effort. If we now take the work of the human factory as a whole, we shall be able to see at the moments when the production of fine substances is arrested by what means we can increase the productivity of the factory. We see that, under ordinary conditions, and working with one mechanical shock, the factory produces a very small quantity of the fine substances, in fact only C12. Working with one mechanical and one conscious shock, the factory now produces a much greater quantity of the fine substances. Working with two conscious shocks, the factory will produce a quantity of the fine substances such as, in the course of time, will completely change the character of the factory itself. The three-story factory represents the universe in miniature and is constructed according to the same laws and on the same plan as the whole universe. In order to understand the analogy between man, the human organism, and the universe, let us take the world as we did before, in the form of three octaves from the absolute to the sun to the earth, and from the earth to the moon. Each of these three octaves lacks a semitone between fa and mi, and in each octave the place of this missing semitone is taken by a certain kind of shock, which is created artificially at the given point. If we now begin to look for an analogy between the three-story factory and the three octaves of the universe, we ought to realize that the three additional shocks in the three octaves of the universe correspond to the three kinds of food entering the human organism. The shock in the lower octave corresponds to physical food. This shock is Do 768 of the cosmic three-story factory. The shock in the middle octave corresponds to air. It is Do 192 of the cosmic factory. The shock in the upper octave corresponds to impressions. It is Do 48 of the cosmic factory. In the inner work of this cosmic three-story factory, all three kinds of food undergo the same transformation as in the human factory, on the same plan and in accordance with the same laws. A further study of the analogy between man and the universe is possible only after an exact study of the human machine and after the respective places of each of the hydrogens in our organism has been established exactly. That means that, to proceed with any further study, we must find the exact purpose of each hydrogen. That is to say, each hydrogen must be defined chemically, psychologically, physiologically, and anatomically. In other words, its functions, its place in the human organism, and, if possible, the peculiar sensations connected with it must be defined. Hey, all is well? Nice to see you. The study of the work of the human organism as a chemical factory shows us three stages in the evolution of the human machine. The first stage refers to the work of the human organism as it has been created by nature, that is to say, to the life and functions of man, number 1, number 2, and number 3. The first octave, that is, the octave of food, develops in a normal way to Me 192. At this point it automatically receives a shock from the beginning of the second octave, and its development goes on consecutively to C12. The second octave, that is the air octave, begins with Do 192 and develops to Mi 48, where it stops. The third octave, that is the octave of impressions, begins with Do 48 and stops there. Thus, 7 notes of the first octave, 3 notes of the second, and 1 note of the third octave represent a complete picture of the work of the human factory in its first or natural stage. Nature has provided only one shock, that is, the shock received from the entrance of the second octave, which helps Me of the first octave to pass to Fa. But nature did not foresee and did not provide for the second shock, that is, the shock that would help the development of the third octave and thereby enable Me of the second octave to pass to Fa. A man must create this shock by his own personal efforts if he desires to increase the output of the fine hydrogens in his organism. The second stage refers to the work of the human organism when a man creates a conscious volitional shock at the point Do 48. In the first place, this volitional shock is transmitted to the second octave, which develops as far as Sol 12, or even further up to La 6, and so on if the work of the organism is sufficiently intense. The same shock also enables the third octave to develop, that is, the octave of impressions, which in this event reaches Mi 12. Thus, in the second stage of the work of the human organism, we see the full development of the second octave and 3 notes of the third octave. The first octave has stopped at the note C12, the third at the note Mi12. Neither of these octaves can proceed any further without a fresh shock. The nature of this second shock cannot be so easily described as the nature of the first volitional shock at Do 48. In order to understand the nature of this shock, it is necessary to understand the meaning of C12 and Mi12. The effort which creates this shock must consist in work on the emotions, in the transformation and transmutation of the emotions. This transmutation of the emotions will then help the transmutation of C12 in the human organism. No serious growth, that is, no growth of higher bodies within the organism, is possible without this transmutation. The idea of this transmutation was known to many ancient teachings, as well as to some comparatively recent ones, such as the alchemy of the Middle Ages. But the alchemists spoke of this transmutation in the allegorical forms of the transformation of base metals into precious ones. In reality, however, they meant the transformation of coarse hydrogens into finer ones in the human organism, chiefly of the transformation of Mi12. If this transformation is attained, a man can be said to have achieved what he was striving for, and it can also be said that until this transformation is attained, all results attained by a man can be lost because they are not fixed in him in any way. Moreover, they are attained only in the spheres of thought and emotion. Real, objective results can be obtained only after the transmutation of Mi12 has begun. Alchemists who spoke of this transmutation began directly with it. They knew nothing, or at least they said nothing, about the nature of the first volitional shock. It is upon this, however, that the whole thing depends. The second volitional shock and transmutation become physically possible only after long practice on the first volitional shock, which consists in self-remembering and in observing the impressions received. On the way of the monk and on the way of the fakir, work on the second shock begins work on the first shock. Oh, sorry, I'll say that again, that doesn't sound right. On the way of the monk and on the way of the fakir, work on the second shock begins before work on the first shock, but as Mi12 is created only as a result of the first shock, work in the absence of other material has of necessity to be concentrated on C12, and it very often gives quite wrong results. Right development on the fourth way must begin with the first volitional shock and then pass on to the second shock at Mi12. The third stage in the work of the human organism begins when man creates in himself a conscious second volitional shock at the point μ12, when the transformation or transmutation of these hydrogens into higher hydrogens begins in him. The second stage and the beginning of the third stage refer to the life and functions of man number 4. A fairly considerable period of transmutation and crystallization is needed for the transition of man number 4 to the level of man number 5. When the table of hydrogens has been sufficiently understood, it shows immediately many new features in the work of the human machine, establishing clearly before anything else the reasons for the differences between the centers and their respective functions. The centers of the human machine work with different hydrogens. This constitutes their chief difference. The center working with a coarser, heavier, denser hydrogen works the slower. The center working with light, more mobile hydrogen works the quicker. Thinking or intellectual center is the slowest of all the three centers we have examined up to now. It works with hydrogen 48, according to the third scale of the table of hydrogens. The moving center works with hydrogen 24. The moving center works with hydrogen 24. Hydrogen 24 is many times quicker and more mobile than hydrogen 48. The intellectual center is never able to follow the work of the moving center. We are unable to follow either our own movements or other people's movements unless they are artificially slowed down. Still less are we able to follow the work of the inner, the instinctive functions of our organism, the work of the instinctive mind, which constitutes, as it were, one side of the moving center. The emotional center can work with hydrogen 12. In reality, however, it very seldom works with this fine hydrogen, and in the majority of cases its work differs little in intensity and speed from the work of the moving center or the instinctive center. In order to understand the work of the human machine and its possibilities, one must know that, apart from these three centers and those connected with them, we have two more centers, fully developed and properly functioning, but they are not connected with our usual life, nor with the three centers in which we are aware of ourselves. The existence of these high centers in us is a greater riddle than the hidden treasures which men who believe in the existence of the mysterious and the miraculous have sought since the remotest times. Since the remotest times. All mystical and occult systems recognize the existence of higher forces and capacities in man, although, in many cases, they admit the existence of these forces and capacities only in the form of possibilities, and speak of the necessity for developing the hidden forces in man. This present teaching differs from many others by the fact that it affirms that the higher centers exist in man and are fully developed. It is the lower centers that are undeveloped, and it is precisely this lack of development or the incomplete functioning of the lower centers that prevents us from making use of the work of the higher centers. As has been said earlier, there are two higher centers, the higher emotional center working with hydrogen 12 and the higher thinking center working with hydrogen 6. If we consider the work of the human machine from the point of view of the hydrogens which work the centers, we shall see why the higher centers cannot be connected with the lower ones. The intellectual center works with hydrogen 48, the moving center with hydrogen 24. If the emotional center were to work with hydrogen 12, its work would be connected with the work of the higher emotional center. In those cases where the work of the emotional center reaches the intensity and speed of existence which is given by hydrogen 12, a temporary connection with the higher emotional center takes place and man experiences new emotions, new impressions hitherto entirely unknown to him, for the description of which he has neither words nor expressions. But in ordinary conditions, the difference between the speed of our usual emotions and the speed of the higher emotional center is so great that no connection can take place, and we fail to hear within us the voices which are speaking and calling to us from the higher emotional center. The higher thinking center, working with hydrogen 6, is still further removed from us, still less accessible. Connection with it is possible only through the higher emotional center. It is only from descriptions of mystical experiences, ecstatic states, and so on that we know cases of such connections. These states can occur on the basis of religious emotions or, for short moments, through particular narcotics, or in certain pathological states such as epileptics, fits, or accidental traumatic injuries to the brain, in which cases it is difficult to say which is the cause and which is the effect, that is, whether the pathological state results from this connection or is its cause. If we could connect the centers of our ordinary consciousness with the higher thinking center deliberately and at will, it would be of no use to us whatever in our present general state. In most cases where accidental contact with the higher thinking center takes place, a man becomes unconscious. The mind refuses to take in the flood of thoughts, emotions, images, and ideas which suddenly burst into it, and instead of a vivid thought or a vivid emotion, there results, on the contrary, a complete blank, a state of unconsciousness. The memory retains only the first moment when the flood rushed in on the mind, and the last moment when the flood was receding and consciousness returned. But even these moments are so full of unusual shades and colors that there is nothing with which to compare them among the ordinary sensations of life. This is usually all that remains from so-called mystical and ecstatic experiences which represent a temporary connection with a higher center. Only very seldom does it happen that a mind which has been better prepared succeeds in grasping and remembering something of what was felt and understood at the moment of ecstasy. But even in these cases, the thinking, the moving, and the emotional centers remember and transmit everything in their own way, translate absolutely new and never previously experienced sensations into the language of usual everyday sensations, transmit in worldly three-dimensional forms things which pass completely beyond the limits of worldly measurements. In this way, of course, they entirely distort every trace of what remains in the memory of the unusual experiences. Our ordinary centers in transmitting the impression of the higher centers may be compared to a blind man speaking of colors, or to a deaf man speaking of music. In order to obtain a correct and permanent connection between the lower and the higher centers, it is necessary to regulate and quicken the work of the lower centers. Moreover, as has been already said, lower centers work in a wrong way, for very often, instead of their own proper functions, one or another of them takes upon itself the work of the other centers. This considerably reduces the speed of the general work of the machine and makes acceleration of the work of the centers very difficult. Thus, in order to regulate and accelerate the work of the lower centers, the primary object must consist in freeing each center from work foreign and unnatural to it, and in bringing it back to its own work, which it can do better than any other center. A great deal of energy is also spent on work which is completely unnecessary and harmful in every respect, such as on the activity of unpleasant emotions, on the expression of unpleasant sensations, on worry, on restlessness, on haste, and on a whole series of automatic actions which are completely useless. As many examples as you like can be found of such unnecessary activity. First of all, there is the constantly moving flow of thoughts in our mind, which we can neither stop nor control, and which takes up an enormous amount of our energy. Secondly, there is the quite unnecessary constant tension of the muscles of our organism. The muscles are tense even when we are doing nothing. As soon as we start to do even a small and insignificant piece of work, a whole system of muscles necessary for the hardest and most strenuous work is immediately set in motion. We pick up a needle from the floor, and we spend on this action as much energy as is needed to lift up a man of our own weight. We write a short letter and use as much muscular energy upon it as would suffice to write a bulky volume. But the chief point is that we spend muscular energy continually and at all times, even when we are doing nothing. When we walk, the muscles of our shoulders and arms are tensed unnecessarily. When we sit, the muscles of our legs, neck, back, and stomach are tensed in an unnecessary way. We even sleep with the muscles of our arms and of our legs, of our face, of the whole of our body tensed, and we do not realize that we spend much more energy on this continual readiness for work we shall never do than on the real, useful work we do during our life. Still further, we can point to the habit of continually talking with anybody and about anything, or, if there is no one else, with ourselves, the habit of indulging in fantastic and daydreaming, the continual change of mood, feelings and emotions, and an enormous number of quite useless things which a man considers himself obliged to feel, think, do, or say. In order to regulate and balance the work of the three centers whose functions constitute our life, it is necessary to learn to economize the energy produced by our organism, not to waste this energy on unnecessary functions, and to save it for that activity which will gradually connect the lower centers to the higher. All that has been said before about work on oneself, about the formation of inner unity, and of the transition from the level of man number 1, number 2, and number 3 to the level of man number 4 and further, pursues one and the same aim. What is called, according to one terminology, the astral body, is called in another terminology the higher emotional center, although the difference here does not lie in the terminology alone. These are, to speak more correctly, different aspects of the next stage of man's evolution. It can be said that the astral body is necessary for the complete and proper functioning of the higher emotional center, in unison with the lower. Or it can be said that the higher emotional center is necessary for the work of the astral body, the mental body corresponding to the higher thinking center. It would be wrong to say that they are one and the same thing, but one requires the other. One cannot exist without the other. One is the expression of certain sides and functions of the other. The fourth body requires the complete and harmonious working of all centers, and it implies, or is the expression of, complete control over this working. What is necessary to understand, and what the table of hydrogens helps us to grasp, is the idea of the complete materiality of all the psychic, intellectual, emotional, volitional, and other inner processes, including the most exalted poetic inspirations, religious ecstasies, and mystical revelations. The materiality of processes means their dependence upon the quality of the material or substance used on them. One process demands the expenditure, that is, as it were, the burning of hydrogen-48. Another process cannot be obtained with the help of hydrogen-48. It requires a finer, a more combustible substance, hydrogen-24. For a third process, hydrogen-24 is too weak. It requires hydrogen-12. Thus, we see that our organism has the different kinds of fuel necessary for the different centers. The centers can be compared to machines working on fuels of different qualities. One machine can be worked on oil, residue, or crude oil. Another requires kerosene. A third will not work with kerosene but requires gasoline. The fine substances of our organism can be characterized as substances of different flashpoints, while the organism itself can be compared to a laboratory in which the combustibles of different strengths required by the different centers are prepared from various kinds of raw material. Unfortunately, however, there is something wrong with the laboratory. The forces controlling the distribution of combustibles among the different centers often make mistakes, and the centers receive fuel that is either too weak or too easily inflammable. Moreover, a great quantity of all the combustibles produced is spent quite uselessly. It simply runs out, is lost. Besides, explosions often take place in the laboratory which at one stroke destroy all the fuel prepared for the next day and possibly for even a longer period, and are able to cause irreparable damage to the whole factory. It must be noted that the organism usually produces in the course of one day all the substances necessary for the following day, and it very often happens that all these substances are spent or consumed upon some unnecessary and, as a rule, unpleasant emotion. bad moods, worry, the expectation of something unpleasant, doubt, fear, a feeling of injury, irritation. Each of these emotions, in reaching a certain degree of intensity, may, in half an hour or even half a minute, consume all the substances prepared for the next day, while a single flash of anger or some other violent emotion can at once explode all the substances prepared in the laboratory and leave a man quite empty inwardly for a long time or even forever. All psychic processes are material. There is not a single process that does not require the expenditure of a certain substance corresponding to it. If this substance is present, the process goes on. When the substance is exhausted, the process comes to a stop. Like I said and warned at the beginning, chapter 9, pretty serious stuff there. And I would say that what we find in chapter 9 is the sort of inner mechanism of our work, of our attempting to self-remember, and very important that sort of can often go unnoticed or overlooked is the second conscious shock, that of working with the emotions, of not speaking unnecessarily, of not expressing negative emotions, of not considering or identifying. This work goes on as well as that of the first conscious shock, which is trying to remember yourself, trying to observe the double impression. Gurdjieff says there, uses the example, the first is I am observing the street or the road, and when you're self-remembering, I'm aware of the street, but I'm also aware of myself, aware of the street. So that is the first conscious shock, which again we learn from all them diagrams and hydrogens that this is the inner workings of the machine, and by what Gurdjieff's saying, as above so below, the workings of the universe, cosmological creation. So it's pretty intense, and when you think about it more and more, you sort of see, and I love that bit at the end there, that final few passages that we read, that if one has an emotional outburst or a deep depression or any other sort of emotion, negative emotion, all of the energy that we had can be gone. And it might just be 10 o'clock in the morning and all your energy's gone. And that's why people, they can't be bothered, or they just sit down scrolling on social media or watching some programs or something. Their energy gets sucked out of them. There's this term, isn't there, vampirism. If you have a negative person in your life, they can act and behave as a vampire. They're sucking all you're trying to be as positive as you can. You're trying to remember yourself. You're doing this work. You're trying to sort of do everything you can. But this individual might not be allowing that to occur. They might be constantly, as much as one is trying, causing you, these negative emotions, and it might be very difficult to do the work in these situations. But Gurdjieff would also say we have to do the work where we find it. But that's not to say that we can't attempt to change our situation to make things a bit easier or to make our life, better. Is the grass always greener? I don't know. But that's to say, when we are doing our work from day to day, we're trying to remember ourselves often and everywhere, and we're trying to develop the second conscious shock, what he said there regarding the emotions, the talking, the identification and all that. You can go back and read the chapter again to extract the sections about this conscious shock, the second conscious shock. And if we're doing these two things day by day, making super efforts, then of course the machine begins to change. Like we read, it can begin to work with the finer substances. The coarser substances are digested and progress, transmuted, the word he uses, into the finer substances, in which case the machine, the organism, works with the finer hydrogens, the finer energy, more rapid vibrations, higher vibrations, and this would be sort of an individual moving towards enlightenment. You know, the enlightened being is the one whose higher emotional center and higher intellectual center are active and at work at all times, because they've got the energy required to sort of keep the processes ongoing. Whereas for people that are beginning their work or progressing, aspiring to higher consciousness, it's about this daily, this daily efforts, as Gurdjieff would say, the daily efforts of trying to remember yourself more regularly, the first conscious shock, and the second conscious shock, like I've just said, working with the emotions. So that's all. Kathy says, it's crazy that we can do all this work collecting energy just to lose it all in the flash with one negative emotion, fear, anger, or irritation. And yes, Kathy, I agree there. And I suppose I was commenting on it just now before I saw your message. And yeah, this is what we're attempting to guard against. But like I've been talking with some people in our group, it is sometimes it's not easy. Sometimes the energy for the second shock is not available, and this is where again it's very helpful. And when we talk about these things and discuss them, you know, I'm trying so hard not to be irritated or impatient with my children, but I can't. I am impatient. I become irritable because, go back to the diagrams and see, I haven't got the potential, I haven't got the fuel, the substance, the energy to be patient, to be, you know, calm. And that's something that I've just come to realize. And yeah, that's why this book, In Search of the Miraculous, and the ideas of Mr. Gurdjieff portrayed by Ouspensky in Search of the Miraculous are so powerful, because although it can be daunting and difficult and at times overwhelming, the diagrams and the deep nature of the connections, and Gurdjieff's talking about, you know, the creation of the universe with the octaves, and then the creation of or the systematic running of the human organism through these diagrams, like I say, is very interesting for me. That's why I'm reading it for you guys. If you think it's interesting, you must let me know, and we can continue our discussion on these subjects. But that's all for now. I don't have anything of substance to say. I could ramble on for another 10 minutes, but that's unnecessary. And so, yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. Go right back to the beginning, listen again, and then listen again, and listen again, and then go back to chapter 1 and listen again. Because for me, I feel that with each chapter, it updates our understanding of all the previous chapters. And then the next chapter updates everything. And then that's not to mention when you finish and you go back to the beginning, and now your reading of chapter 1 is updated because you know the rest of the book. So read and read and reread, and we'll have more Gurdjieff work. We'll have more Gurdjieff textbooks coming after In Search of the Miraculous. Not sure where we're heading yet, but it's under review. And you're very welcome, Kathy. I hope you're doing well. And like I say, this work is ongoing, right? As we just learned there, we have to create the substances in order to do our work. But for now, guys, take care of yourselves. I'll see you next time for chapter 10. Bye now.